بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله تبارك وتعالى وسلم على سيدنا محمد سيدنا وسندنا وحبيبنا وشفيعنا ومولانا صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه وأزواجه وذرياته وأهل بيته ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين وبعد. This week we read from the Matn of Ibn ʿāshir, al-Murshid al-Mu'in, some miscellaneous issues with regards to Ghusl, which is, as we said before, the procedure in the Sharī'ah through which a person will remove themselves from a major state of ritual impurity and restore themselves back to ritual purity using water. So before going through the lesson, let's go ahead and read the lines that we're going to go over this week in order to facilitate their memorization for those who wish to memorize. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. تبدأ في الغسل بفرج ثم كف عن مسه ببطن أو جنب الأكف أو إصبع ثم إذا مسسته أعد من الوضوء ما فعلته موجبه حيض نفاس إنزال مغيب كمرات بفرج إسجال والأولان منع الوطأ إلى غسل والآخران قرآنا جلا والكل مسجدا وسهو الاغتصال مثل وضوئك ولم تعد موال. So these are the masail regarding ghusl that are left over from our last lesson. I thought it would become too lengthy if we just crammed it all together. So we separated it into two portions. In the next two lines, he basically describes the order in which it's preferred for a person to make ghusl, the order of items and actions. That a person should first begin with the washing of the private parts. This can also be stated in a different way, that a person should begin their ghusl by removing filth from their body. So this is technically not part of ghusl. If you remember from our lesson in Akhdari, the tahara is of two types, taharatul khabath and taharatul hadath. One is the tahara, the purification that has to do with removing filth from a person's body or their clothing or the place of prayer, etc., which is different than the ritual purification by which a person elevates their ritual status, their ritual condition from minor impurity or major impurity into ritual purity. So in that sense, a person can be in a state of tahara ritually. You can have ritual purity, you can be in a state of tahara, but you can have some najis on you. Something najis, something impure fell on you. So for example, drop of urine came on your body, you just wash it off. It's not like you lost your wudu. And then on the flip side, a person can have, be in a state of ritual impurity and not have any najasa on them. So the thing is, all of that stuff that requires a person to make ghusl, that renders a person in major ritual impurity, all of it has some sort of najasa involved with it. So if it's that a person went through inzal, which is essentially orgasm and ejaculation, then whatever comes out of the private parts is najis. If it's, for example, copulation, that the male private part went into the female private part, or whatever other permutations we'll talk about shortly, then in that case there is an exchange of najasa between two people. And if it's hayd or nifas, the bleeding of menses or the bleeding of postnatal bleeding after birth, after giving birth, then those are all najasat. So the first thing a person does it's recommended before they actually start the ritual ghusl, is that they remove the najasa from their body, the ritual impurity or the filth from their body. And then we mentioned from before the recommendation of starting with the limbs of wudu. And so he also gives the advice that a person should be careful not to, a person in the sense of a man in particular, should be careful not to touch his member with the palm side of the hand or fingers, or the sides of the hand or the fingers. Why? Because that will break wudu. Because the process of ghusl will both restore a person out of major ritual impurity and minor ritual impurity. But if in the process of making ghusl a person does something to break their minor ritual impurity, then they will still be impure. So a person should be careful while making ghusl not to do anything to break that. So in the case of a man, the most likely thing is that they will touch their member with the side or with the palm of their hands or fingers. But any of the other things, if a person urinates in the middle, or a person defecates, or whatever other things break wudu, if a person does any of those things, then the part of the ghusl that they've done is still valid, and they can go ahead and complete the ghusl, and it will take them out of janaba, out of minor or out of major ritual impurity, but then they're going to have to repeat the wudu. So a person should be careful not to break their wudu while making ghusl, just in order to not have to repeat their wudu afterwards separately than the ghusl. He says, إِذَا مَسَسْتَهُ, if you did happen to touch your private part with the side or with the palm of your hand or fingers, then you don't have to start the entire ghusl again from the beginning. Rather, you just have to wash the limbs of wudu again, and you may proceed with your ghusl. And then he mentions what are those things that put a person in the major state of ritual impurity, that oblige them to make ghusl, and what are the rulings of being in a state of major ritual impurity that are connected with it. What are those things that are impermissible when you're in that state? So he says that there are 4 things that cause a person to be in a state of major ritual impurity, that render a person in a major state of ritual impurity. The first is hayd, which is menstrual bleeding. The second is nifas, which is postnatal bleeding. And both of them are similar in the sense that a woman experiences hayd, she experiences menstruation. Why? Because the tissue on the inside of the uterus, the womb, prepares to receive a fertilized egg and becomes vascularized and becomes ready to receive that egg in order to nurture it and nourish it into a baby, and into an embryo, and then into a fetus. And when that does not happen, what happens is that infrastructure, that physiological infrastructure inside of the uterus, inside of the womb, it doesn't last a very long time. And so if it's not used, the body has to trash it, has to get rid of it. And so what it will do is it will slowly kind of get expelled out of the uterus, and that's the whole process of menses. And so the Prophet ﷺ, he differentiated between the dam of hayd and the dam of istihada, the blood of menstruation and the blood of chronic menstrual bleeding. So some women suffer this, that their cycles are extremely long. You guys will remember from the Mālikī school, the longest that hayd can last is how long? 15 days. In the Hanafi school, it's what? 10 days. But at any rate, the fuqaha have an agreement that there is a longest amount of time that it can last. After that amount of time elapses, the Mālikī school, it's 15 days is the absolute longest it can last, but it doesn't necessarily have to be 15. For a woman whose normal habit is much shorter than that, then it's 3 days above her habit until she's considered to be in chronic postmenstrual bleeding. So what happens is that the Prophet ﷺ himself differentiated. He said that a woman who bleeds for longer than the maximum amount of hayd, that blood is not the blood of hayd. It's not the womb expelling its lining. Rather, it is like a wound, like any other wound. If a person has like a cut, it's bleeding, it's like that. It's not the same as hayd. It's not the same as menstruation. And so this book doesn't cover istihada all that much length. Inshallah, when we finish it, Allah Ta'ala give us tawfiq. When we read the Risala, there's a bit more about istihada over there, inshallah, and we'll cover it over there. And then we also covered it in some at least cursory detail in the Matn of Al-Akhdari, rahimahullah tabarak wa ta'ala. But the point is that it's different, and so the dam of hayd has a special hukum associated with it. It's not just bleeding. That's what you need to understand. It's not just bleeding, because just bleeding, whether it's a man or a woman, it doesn't have all the same things going on. With the expulsion of the lining of the uterus, there's a bunch of hormonal changes. There's a bunch of stuff that happens, and it really is a rahmah, it's a mercy of the Sharī'ah that women are to take a rest and not to participate in ritual, in the ritual prayers, nor are they obligated to participate in the ritual prayers and fasting during that time. Because I think what it is the people have their kind of baggage, Judeo-Christian baggage that they carry with them, that somehow or another is aslan misogynistic and considers these things to be like God's punishment on women and whatever. And we don't have that idea in Islam, that this is some sort of, I don't recall ever reading about hayd being a punishment from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on women. It's definitely considered a burden, but it's not a punishment. And so we think about it differently. It's a mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, forcing a woman who's going through that to have to do all the exact same things that she would have had she not had to go through all of that, that's a type of zulm as far as I can tell. And I'm not alone in thinking that, nor are Muslims alone in thinking that. My understanding is 2 countries in the world, Spain and Korea, South Korea, they give a woman 1 day off a month, no questions asked. And it's supposed to be for the day that the strain of the hayd is the heaviest. And we're like, yo, what if the strain is more than 1 day? Like, why should it only be 1 day like that? But there's, these ahkam are associated with that. It's good to understand it and what it is and why it's there and where it's coming from. Nifas then also is then kind of like a superlative expression of the same phenomenon, that if hayd is the body's expulsion of the lining that was preparing to host a pregnancy, then nifas is the expulsion of that lining that was there for 9 months actually sustaining the pregnancy. And so it's much more, and so it should be expected that it could last much longer theoretically. Do you remember what the longest amount of time nifas can last for? 60 days, right? And then Hanafi madhab, you remember?
90?
For 40. But at any rate, the idea is that nifas also, you see the symmetry, right? There, one is 1.5 times longer than the other. The idea is that also that's very difficult. It's hormonally difficult. It's physically painful. If a period is physically painful, nifas is like really painful because the uterus kind of contracts back and adjusts back to its normal size and its normal state. So again, these two, when they're done, when the blood stops, then the bleeding stops, then a woman is at that point to make ghusl, and then she can re-enter the ritual state of purity, and then is obliged to pray and fast and all these other things again. Then number 3, the third thing that makes ghusl obligatory is inzal. Inzal is what? Inzal is ejaculation / orgasm. And it can happen for a man, it can happen for a woman as well. Interestingly, in the literature of Islam, including hadith, the idea is that a woman can have not just orgasm, but a woman can actually ejaculate some liquid, similarly to the ejaculation of a man. That this idea is there, and it's physiologically it's a phenomenon that occurs. At any rate, if that occurs to a man or to a woman, then that will necessitate ghusl. And then the fourth is maghibu kamratin bi farjin isjal. So he says the fourth is the obscuring of the kamra. Kamra is a synonym for hashafa, for the glans, the head of the penis, that if it goes deep enough into the private part of a woman, then that it's visually obscured. You can't see it anymore. Then that causes ghusl to be wajib as well. Now, note the two things. One is the orgasm and ejaculation on one hand, and the other is the entering of the male private part into the female private part on the other hand. They can accompany one another or they can be separate. Orgasm can occur without the male private part going into the female private part through other things, through touching and I guess in some extreme examples, if a person is very stimulated and very sensitive, it can happen even without touching, theoretically speaking, for a man, for a woman. And on the flip side, the male private part could go into the female private part. It could not. It might even not be erect. It might even, it may not result in orgasm or ejaculation. The two things might be separate. So if either one of those things happen, then a person has to make ghusl. And if either one of those happens, a person has to make ghusl, is obliged to make ghusl. And this word isjal it means itlaq or irsal. And the commentaries say that it's an ishara toward the idea that ghusl is wajib if the male private part goes into any farj, anything is farj, or is something that can be put into analogy with farj. Farj is a general word, it can mean either the male or female sexual organ, private part, but this includes the vagina. This also includes the anus. It includes the anus of a male or a female. It includes all of the above for the living or for the dead or for humans or for other species of animals. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. Obviously those are all like haram. Those are all very haram. It's haram for a man to, for example, have anal intercourse with his wife. It's even more haram to do it with another woman. It's even more haram than that to do it with a man. It's even more haram to do it with a dead man. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ. Like all of these things, or and with animals and all of these things. But there's a fiqhi hukum attached to those things. They're all haram as well. Whereas when a man has sexual intercourse properly and normally with his wife, it's not haram. But that hukum is separated from this, that in all of them it necessitates that a person have to make ghusl again because they put themselves in a state of major ritual impurity. So finally in the last line he says that the first two, that the state of the first two will make unlawful sexual intercourse until ghusl. So if a woman is bleeding from menstruation or is bleeding from postnatal bleeding, in both of those cases it's haram for a woman to have sexual intercourse with her husband until she makes ghusl. So even if the bleeding stops, until ghusl has been made, sexual intercourse is impermissible. And the second two make it haram for a person to recite the Quran. So what are they? They are the orgasm or ejaculation of either a male or female, and the entrance of the male private part into the female private part, or whatever other haram permutation thereof. And so for those people, it's haram for them to recite the Quran. Now, the way the line is structured, it indicates that it is permissible for a woman in menstruation or in postnatal bleeding to recite the Quran. And this is the case, that it's permissible for a woman to recite the Quran. She won't be allowed to touch the mushaf. All of those things that are haram for a person to do when they're in hadath, in minor ritual impurity, they also are haram in major ritual impurity. However, in the Mālikī school, there is a rukhsa, a dispensation for the students and teachers of the Quran to be able to touch the mushaf of their lesson. So touch the lawh of their lesson or the juz of their lesson. In the old days, people didn't used to own masahif. Now that's what most students, at least over here, memorize from. They don't memorize from alwah like they do in West Africa and like they used to in the other parts of the Muslim world in older times. So then that makes the mushaf also permissible for the teacher and the student of Quran to touch. But you have to be actually actively taking lessons in hifz or in nazara or something like that for this to apply to you. You can't just say, in general, I'm a student of knowledge, so I don't have to have wudu to touch the Quran. The rukhsa, the dispensation, is only for the people who are active students for their lesson. So even those active students, if they want to make tilawah, they want to recite the Quran as an act of worship, they also need to make wudu before they touch the mushaf. But the rukhsa, the dispensation of not needing to be in a state of ritual purity to touch the mushaf, it does extend to women in hayd. They're allowed to recite anyway, there's no rukhsa there, that's just the madhab. But for them to be able to touch the mushaf, because of them being teachers and students, that does apply to them in hayd as well. And so you'll see that many maktabs and many hifz classes for women will take this dispensation of the Mālikī school. So you should understand the way that works so that you can issue it as well for people's benefit. Otherwise, it makes it very difficult for women to do hifz if they have to, take a break from both touching the mushaf and from reciting while they're in hayd. وَالْكُلُّ مَسْجِدًا. And in all four cases, it's haram for such a person who's in that state of ritual impurity, major ritual impurity, to enter a masjid. And this is also a problem in the United States, that many people, they quote-unquote built masajid, but they didn't have knowledge about what the sacred law is. And so they made the intention of the endowment of the masjid to be the entire prayer area. So women, technically it's haram for them to go. Technically even a kafir, it's haram for them to go because there's no way for them to be in a state of purity. That's obviously on top of the fact that the Mālikī Fiqh prohibits a kafir from entering a masjid in general, but it's still a problem. It's still problematic in many ways. Whereas the people making the endowment should make the intention only of the first couple of sufuf or lines, or of one side or another, so that they can have their invite guests into the space to at least see it if that's what they wish to do. And to have a space for women to be able to listen to khutbahs and to listen to talks and to participate in classes if that's what they wish to do. Some of the more egregious modes of endowing a masjid in this continent that people have screwed up on is that they'll make the intention for the entire building to be the masjid, which technically will render the bathrooms the masjid as well. It's haram to urinate or defecate in a masjid. And so, there's really nothing you can do after that except for pour concrete into the toilets, fill them in, make tawbah for having used them incorrectly, and then build another bathroom outside of the facility that's endowed. You'll see that. That's why old school masajid are like that. Have you ever seen a masjid in the Muslim world that was built before 50 years ago, in which the bathroom is the same building as the main building of the masjid? Any of you have been to the Masjid Fatir downtown? Marhum Muhammad Ali, Allah Ta'ala accept from him and Allah Ta'ala immerse him in His mercy and forgive him his sins. He built the Masjid Fatir. You'll see that the bathroom is actually a separate building as the masjid. There's like wudu stations inside the same building as the masjid, but the bathrooms are literally, you have to go outside, walk outside to a separate building. It's not necessary for it to be that way. You can technically just make the intention of the masjid for a certain part of the building. In some sense, I think that I could understand why a person would make the bathrooms part of the same physical structure, even if they didn't make the intention of the endowment of the masjid over the bathrooms. Why? Because you have some very cold days over here. So like, to make someone outside to -30 to make wudu or whatever. I could see why that's an issue, right? But at any rate, there's no excuse to muddle this up, and this is one of the severe incorrect consequences of having considered an ill thought out endowment of a masjid, is that it will bar women and other people from participation in the masjid, or if they come, it will be a sin on them and a sin on those people who misendowed the masjid. وسهو الاغتسال مثل وضوئك ولم تعد موال. He says that if you forget a limb or a patch of skin when making ghusl, and then you remember later, then all you do is you go and wash that patch of skin or you wash that limb. You don't have to redo the entire ghusl again. Why? Because the fawr or mawalat, which are two synonyms, the fawr meaning the obligation to complete the constituent parts of ghusl one by one without too much delay between any two parts, and mawalat meaning exactly the same thing, the connectedness of them, that you shouldn't interrupt them with something major in the middle, that whatever interruption happens between one part of ghusl and the other, it should not be longer than the amount of time it takes the limbs to dry on a moderate day. So somewhere between 2 or 3 minutes. It shouldn't take longer than that. But if a person forgot a patch of skin or an entire limb, and then they later on remember, oh my gosh, I didn't wash this patch of skin, or I didn't wash this limb, they can just go back and wash that patch of skin or wash that limb. But whatever prayers they prayed, they have to make them all up. So if a person remembers, or it occurs to them that they forgot a limb or a patch of skin after a month, all they have to do is go back and wash that limb or patch of skin. But the prayers they prayed in between, they have to make them up. Akhdari, Sahib al-Mukhtasar, he mentions something you guys might remember when we read that, which is if a person made wudu later and the wudu also covered that patch of skin or that limb, then that will be sufficient to complete the ghusl, even if a person did it with the intention of wudu. You understand what I'm saying? Again, the obligation to perform the prayer in the state of tahara, the ritual state of tahara, it's absolute. There's nothing that can mitigate it. So if you prayed without a complete wudu, then, or a complete state of tahara, then your prayer will not be valid. Are there any questions related to this? Go ahead, pick up the mic and ask.
Can you please just repeat that? Did you say that if you miss a part during the ghusl and then you did the wudu afterward that ended up covering that part, that means you don't have to?
Yeah, so for example, if a person missed a patch of skin on their arm, on the lower part of their arm, then while making ghusl, and then afterward they made wudu and had to wash that part anyway, and then they realized later on, after that even, that, oh, I missed that patch of skin when making ghusl, the ghusl is considered to have been complete through that, catching that wind wudu. However, if the patch of skin is, for example, on your thigh, which you don't make wudu on, then you have to go back obviously and wash that, so that is inapplicable. Are there any other questions? Barakallahu feekum. Sallallahu ta'ala ala rasulihi Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.